Welcome back. This is Geography 10, Lecture 12. I've made a couple of small alterations to the slides since I posted them. First, I took the first item off this list here on the title slide. Slavery continued. We're not going to talk about slavery today. We're going to talk about capitalism, what it means, and how it began. So we're going to focus in particular on the short reading that I asked you to do from Max Weber's General Economic History on what capitalism is, or how to define it, how to identify it. And then we're going to look at the conditions under which it first emerged as such in the form that Weber is thinking about it, which is to say England and the Industrial Revolution. The second change I've made is on this slide where it said map quizzes next week. That was true last week when I posted the lecture, but it's not true anymore. So it should read map quiz this week in sections, as I assume you already know. Sorry about that. To remind again, bibliographies are due in sections the week after spring break. I promised you today that I would talk a little bit about the bibliographies, and I will save some time at the end for that. The readings for today continue on in Bernstein, pages 252 to 265, and the Weber selections. On Thursday, next time we meet, we will watch a movie here in lecture called Black Gold, Wake Up and Smell the Coffee. That is a movie about coffee production, specifically in Ethiopia today, in the present time. And it will provide an opportunity for us to think more about these definitional characteristics of capitalism and how it relates to other forms of production, other modes of production, social relations related to production. In other words, trying to emphasize that this process that I'm going to describe today is not simply a matter of history. It's not simply something that happened 200 years ago or so in England and somehow is done. It's actually something that continues to unfold even up to the present time. Are there any questions from last lecture? Any lingering unclarities? One other thing I might note, the midterms, we have nearly finished grading them, or rather the GSIs have nearly finished grading them, and our plan is to get them back to you on Thursday. We have to figure out how that works with the movie, but we'll figure something out. I also want to emphasize, before you even begin to start thinking about how to interpret your grade on the midterm, the grades for the entire semester for the class will be curved. And to that extent, your percentage grade on the midterm is only important insofar as it compares to what everyone else got, right? So when you see that number on your midterm, I will also put up on the board on Thursday, or whenever we give them back to you, the average grade and that sort of thing, the distribution of grades, so that you can compare your score to those of everyone else in the class. That is what matters. Furthermore, moreover, I hate trying to say those two words at the same time. Really, it's at the very end of the semester when we total all of the scores from all of the exams and assignments or whatever, quizzes, papers. That's the score that will be curved that will ultimately determine your grade. Okay? Any questions about that? Okay? Reading's continued. When you come back from break, we'd like you to have read the section in your reader from Marx. That will continue the discussion of what capitalism means and how it came to be. For Thursday, the 1st of April, we'd like you to read George Orwell's famous essay, Shooting an Elephant, which will allow us to think about colonialism. And then Chapter 2 of Delaney for the 6th of April, and Atlas pages 42 to 69. All right. So thus far, from the first section of Bernstein, Bernstein offers us sort of two ways of defining capitalism, right? One of them is the production of goods for exchange to make a profit. And he says that is defining of capitalism. However, it's also something that is not unique to capitalism. In other words, there have been other societies, other economic formations in history that have also met that definition, but which are not capitalism. So you have other societies where there are markets, a division of labor, the production of goods for exchange, and the making of profit from the exchange of those goods. What you need, or what's more specific to capitalism, he says, are the social relations that accompany that form, that social organization. And he says the specific thing concerns the relationship of wage labor to the owners of the means of production. In other words, the division of society into a class of people who own the tools and other materials necessary to produce goods. And then on the other side, people who do not own those things, own simply their own labor time, labor power, and sell their labor power to the people who own those things and then work for them to produce goods. He says this is unique to capitalism. He says this involves also the notion or the reality that land and labor both are commodities. In other words, they can be bought and sold on the market just like other things. Okay? That's not unfamiliar to us. We're used to that. We're so used to it that it might strike us as scarcely worth mentioning. But it is historically unique, and it actually took a great deal of time and struggle for that to become the case, even in only parts of the world. And there are parts of the world in which those conditions, in fact, to this day, do not obtain. It's not the case that land and labor are simply things you can buy in many parts of the world. So we have to think about how those conditions came to be in the first instance. Sort of where did they first come into play? And we have to think about why or how they became a kind of self-perpetuating, self-expanding system. In other words, if it happened in one place at one time, fine, so what? That wouldn't necessarily be that noteworthy. However, they came together in that place and time and proceeded to spread and become the dominant way of organizing social relations between people, land, resources, and time throughout much of the world. So how did that happen? Max Weber, we've met him already, right? He's the interesting, erudite, somewhat strange German sociologist from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He gave us the definition of the state. He also gave us the definition of nation that we've been working with. He also, as I mentioned before, read more or less everything that was available at the time he was living about economic history. And he wrote a book called The General Economic History. And the reading is from that book. And in it, he provides us his definition of capitalism, which is slightly different, perhaps, from Bernstein, but not incompatible with Bernstein. He says it's the rational, it's a society in which rational, calculating, industrial provision of human needs predominates. He has a very specific, detailed notion of what rational and calculating mean? What do you think he means by rational and calculating? Anybody read other Max Weber? He's one of these people who wrote something about just about anything you can think of in sociology, the study of society. He wrote books about religion. He wrote books about power and authority. Anybody know, when he says rational, what does he not mean? Yes?
Well, I know I've taken like a class on like international relations, and like a rational leader is a leader who has like a goal and then do things that like perpetuate reaching that goal. So even though like morally it may be irrational, like they are rationally reaching the goal.
Okay, okay. Means and ends. Rationality for Weber means that you undertake the pursuit of specific defined objectives in a rational fashion, aiming simply to do it as efficiently and as logically as you can. He describes 3 bases for authority in the world. He says there is traditional authority, in which leaders have the authority to lead and to tell people what to do simply because that's the way it's always been done, right? It's a tradition. It's what everyone's used to. It may or may not be based on anything else besides the sort of status and authority vested in tradition. He says that's not what capitalism is about. Capitalism, in fact, tends to erode or get rid of traditional forms of authority precisely because they're not rational enough. What if the traditional leader happens to be somebody who's just, incompetent? What if the traditional leader says, it rains because this spirit medium does certain dances at a certain time of year, and the rain is what keeps us all alive, so you have to obey me and this spirit person because we bring the rain. And then the rain fails. And he says, no, I'm still in charge. And you say, well, wait a minute, you're supposed to bring the rain. And he says, well, I'm still in charge. And the people say, well, that doesn't make any sense. The rational impulse would say, we're going to get rid of this person. We're going to put somebody in charge on a basis that makes more sense. Another form he describes of authority and power is charismatic, in which the leader promises certain kinds of a certain future, and it's based solely in that leader's sort of personality. It's a magnetic personality. It draws people to follow and obey, and they get caught up in this person, and sort of whatever this person says is what should happen. It doesn't matter if he says the one thing on Tuesday and a different thing completely on Friday. Who cares? He's the charismatic leader. Weber sees a lot of this in the history of the world as an important kind of authority, something that makes people do what other people say they should do. And he says, this is also not rational. There's all kinds of room for irrationality in charismatic leadership. So the third form he offers is rational authority, in which you have a clearly defined goal and rules, and those rules apply across the board as such, and they fit together in a logical way. You don't have 2 sets of rules that are inconsistent with each other. You make them all fit. And they're consistent in time. And at that point, the authority is based on the notion that this makes sense. This makes logical sense. It meets our interests in a logical way. It's efficient. And the sort of bureaucratic organization of government agencies in this country and in much of the world, to the extent that it's rational, and sometimes it's not, fits this Weberian notion of authority and power in the modern world. So in this case, what we have is the application of those kinds of principles to the production of goods in an industrial fashion. And we'll talk more about what industrial means as the lecture goes on. And his point here in this essay is to say that this is the predominant way of providing goods in a capitalist society. It's not the only way. It's not that there aren't also things made for our needs that aren't made this way. But the predominant way is rational, calculating, industrial provision of human needs. He says without it, the whole economic system must collapse. And this is actually how he distinguishes capitalism from those other ancient societies in which you also had a division of labor and money and exchange and markets. He says in those settings, yeah, you had this to some degree, but if it were to be taken away from those societies, the societies themselves would not be completely transformed. They would not collapse. In a capitalist society, if you take this part out, you just sort of imagine as a thought experiment that suddenly this was gone. He says the whole society, the whole system would fall apart. The system has become dependent on this kind of production. And he says this dates to the mid-19th century. Any questions? So he offers us a list of presuppositions. And it might be worth noting that what Weber is doing here, the way he's generating these ideas, these insights, is in fact inductively, which is to say he's looking at all of the different examples of economic systems he can find in the literature, from all over the world, going all the way back in time as far as the documents can reach. And he's looking for commonalities. He's looking for patterns in what he sees. And he's distilling these patterns out of all of these examples. And he's asking, what are the conditions that are necessary in order for this particular system to obtain, to happen on the ground? In other words, what are the essential conditions of possibility for a capitalist system, which is a slightly different way of defining it than simply saying it equals X, right? Saying, okay, these are the features. What do you need in order for those features actually to exist? And he's arriving at it again by looking at all those settings in which this system exists and then asking, what do you need? What if you took it away, would prevent this system from existing? So here they are. Number one, appropriation of all physical means of production, land, apparatus, machinery, tools, etc., as disposable property of autonomous private industrial enterprises. You translate this into Marx's language, and it's simply, this is the ownership of the means of production as private property. Weber's got a whole bunch of other words here to sort of qualify it more carefully, right? It has to be disposable. It's not just that the means of production are owned by a certain group of people. It's that they, in fact, can get rid of them if they want to. They can sell them. They're disposable. You have complete control over them, not only in the sense that they're yours to use, but in the sense that they're yours to dispose of if you wish. And that includes land. It also effectively means labor. You can hire it and you can fire it. 2, freedom of the market. No irrational limitations on trading. Irrational. That would mean any restrictions not based in the sense of rationality that I just described. Again, like this, we're so accustomed to production being organized for the sake of production in a rational way, right? If we run into, I'm sure you've had this experience dealing with, say, the university bureaucracy. You run into something that just doesn't make sense. It seems irrational. Like, the point is to get this done. And you seem to have a system that prevents me from getting this done and causes us all to go around in circles, and it's irrational. Well, that's the kind of sense we're talking about here. We're generally accustomed, we get frustrated if we see production organized in a way that seems not to make any sense. We want to see it organized as efficiently as possible. Well, here we're talking about limitations on trading. And what he means is there shouldn't be any limitations on trading that don't make a kind of crisp, efficient, rational sense. And the key kinds of examples, or a key example we're going to talk about, is limitations on trading labor power. What kinds of limitations do we have in our society on who you can sell your labor power to, or who can hire whom to do what? Do we have limits on that? Yeah. Excuse me. We have child labor laws. We have laws that say you can't hire a 7-year-old to work in your factory. Is that a rational or an irrational limitation on trading? It's rational, insofar as it's grounded in some definable notion of the larger good, right? It's not good for society to make 7-year-olds work in factories. It's not good for them individually, and it's not good for society insofar as the future well-being, the next generation, is put at risk and prevented from going to school and doing other things that are, in the long run, more valuable to society. Can you think of any irrational constraints on the trade of labor in our society? What are some other examples of limitations? Can any old person be a doctor? There's a limitation on who can sell their labor power as a doctor, right? They have to be credentialed. They have to have been trained. They have to be certified. That's a limitation on their ability to trade, on everyone's ability to trade their labor power. You're not free to just declare yourself a doctor. But is it a rational one or an irrational one? It's rational. What if there were a law that said the only people who can be doctors are people whose fathers were doctors? Or that said, if your father was a doctor, you have to be a doctor. It's decided before you're even born. Because your father or your mother is a doctor, you grow up, you'll be a doctor too. Is that rational or irrational? That's irrational. By Weber's definition, that is clearly irrational for any number of reasons. The son or daughter might not want to be a doctor. They might not be any good at being a doctor. Society might need more doctors or fewer doctors, and simply having it be limited to the offspring of doctors kind of constrains how many of them there can be. For no particularly clear, logical, instrumental reason either. It would just be clinging to some kind of tradition. Well, the societies that preceded capitalism in Europe, those kinds of rules were actually extremely commonplace, right? There were fairly strict, clear rules that said the only people who, for instance, can be blacksmiths shall be the children of other blacksmiths, or shall be people who manage to make friends with the blacksmith and make their way into a society of blacksmiths, and they shall be the blacksmiths, and nobody else shall be allowed to be a blacksmith no matter what they want to do or how good they are at it. Guild organization of labor by craft. Weber's going to suggest that that is irrational. It's clinging to a kind of tradition. And sure, it obtained for a long time in a lot of places, but in the eyes of this system, it doesn't make sense. It does not serve the logical, rational, calculating logic of this system to have those kinds of limitations. So a free market means, yes, there can be limitations on trading, but those limitations have to make sense in a kind of logical, rational sense They can't be grounded simply in tradition or sort of, these sort of rules that don't make sense for the good of producing goods and society as a whole. Yeah? Trade embargoes such as those on Cuba? It would depend how they were justified, right? I mean, if it were justified on the grounds that we aren't going to trade with any countries that speak Spanish and have a strongly Afro-American culture, that would be irrational. If, on the other hand, there's some, if you said, well, we're going to not trade with Cuba because we want to protect the U.S. sugar industry, which, in fact, arguably is or was at one point the logic for embargoing Cuban sugar, that would be a rational argument. Any of you experienced irrational limitations on your ability to sell your labor power? Is it rational to you that once you get a degree, a college degree, you have more freedom, or rather you can sell your labor power more readily to more people to do more things than you could before or without? Anyone else have any thoughts or questions on this matter? Okay. Third presupposition of capitalism: rational, mechanized technology in production and commerce. And we're going to talk about this at much greater length a little bit later in the lecture. He suggests that without this, capitalism as it has come to be would not exist. So this is an important piece. Fourth, calculable law. By this he means predictable and rational. Any idea what he means by that? And why is this so important? Why does the law need to be predictable? Yeah. Okay, precisely. If you are interested in selling things, buying things, organizing production, investing in a factory, or signing contracts to sell the things your factory is going to make, you want to know ahead of time that that contract will be recognized as a legally binding contract, right? That it will be enforced, that it will be enforced in a way that is not partial or capricious. You sign one contract that says, I buy this piece of land. I'm giving this person this much money, and this person is giving me this land in return, and now it's mine. You want to know, okay, never mind. You want to know that, in fact, your ownership of that land will be recognized not just now, but into the future, so that you can proceed to invest in that land to do certain things that aren't going to actually pay off until the future, somewhere down the road. You want to know that it's not the case that if somebody else comes along and says, no, that's my land, and the reason it's my land is that I'm the great-great-great-grandson of somebody who owned it or possessed it 400 years ago. You want to know that the state is going to stand up and say, no, sorry, that's not grounds for owning this land. You need to have the title, and the title has been bought, and we know it because it's recorded and that kind of thing. So it's predictable in the sense that it's stable. It's enforced in a way that's impartial. It's calculable in the sense that you can actually run the numbers and see how it's going to play out, right? You're going to be able to figure out what the taxes are going to be on a certain kind of production or the tariffs on a certain kind of trade. And you can figure that into your assessment of how to organize production rationally. And if the state isn't there to back up those types of claims in a rational way, you can't organize production in this fashion. This gets straight to Delaney's discussion of property and sovereignty. This is the same thing. But Weber is locating it historically as a necessary condition for the emergence of this kind of production. Is my microphone dying? It feels to me like maybe I'm just... Okay. Oops. And then fifth, free labor. Workers who in the formal sense voluntarily, but actually under the compulsion of the whip of hunger, sell their labor on the market without restriction. So this is a further statement and actually an expansion of the point a moment ago about a free market. We said there needs to be a free market, no irrational restrictions on trading, and I used labor as an illustration. Here he's going one step further. He's saying there must be a class of people who voluntarily, in the legal sense, sell their labor power, which is to say they walk in and strike a deal that is legally a deal between equals, right? They say, I want to sell my labor power to you. The other person says, I want to buy it. They agree on a wage, and they go to work. And in that sense, the worker could decide not to do this, right? But Weber's saying that fulfills a sort of condition of no irrational restrictions on who can trade their labor with whom, but it doesn't actually meet the full sense of what he's talking about here. Actually under the compulsion of the whip of hunger, which is to say these people sell their labor power because they have no other way to make a living. They can't produce their own goods, their own food on their own. They have to sell their labor power to get money to buy the things they need. So this is quite explicitly Bernstein's second definition of capitalism, or more specific definition of capitalism. Are there questions? Okay. Finally, sixth, general use of commercial instruments to represent share rights in enterprise and also in property ownership. What does this mean? We've talked a little bit about this previously in connection with Bernstein. I've alluded to it already here today. He's saying, and this is, I mean, again, this is so normal to us as perhaps to seem scarcely worth mentioning. But Weber is very interested in this. He's saying you have shares. Ownership is mediated by essentially pieces of paper. Instead of saying, I own this factory, and it's just mine, and everyone acknowledges that it's mine, and therefore it's mine, you have a piece of paper that represents that factory, and that factory, in fact, can be owned by a whole bunch of people who each own a piece of the factory, which isn't to say that they each own a brick or each own one machine. It's to say they each own a piece of paper that represents, for example, 1/100th of the factory as a whole. There's 100 shares, and you own the factory by owning the shares, and the shares can be bought and sold in their own right. They can be divided up or put back together. There can be 100 shares one day and 200 shares the next day by simply declaring we're going to have a stock split. This factory is now worth so much more money than it used to be that we think we can have 200 shares, and they'll still be worth about what they were before. This happens all the time. This is what Wall Street is about. The buying and selling of representations of ownership that are themselves sort of equal parts. They're all indistinguishable among themselves for the most part. He's saying this is a necessary precondition for capitalism, that ownership in the rights of enterprise and property shall be mediated by these commercial instruments, these pieces of paper. This sounds a little odd, but basically he's going to say this is necessary because it allows you to do a whole lot of things that are hard to do otherwise. It allows for efficiencies in the buying and selling of ownership of things, the means of production in the first instance, but actually a variety of other things. Right? You can buy a bond, which is ownership of a stream of revenue that will be generated in the future by the tax powers of the state. You are essentially lending your money to the state, and the state is agreeing to pay you back with interest over time, and you have confidence that that can happen because the state can assess taxes and collect revenue and have money to pay you back. You are buying a piece of that revenue stream. So he says, to sum up, it must be possible to conduct the provision for needs exclusively on the basis of market opportunities and the calculation of net income. This is the rational, calculating, industrial provision of goods. Are there any questions? Let's take our 5-minute break now. Okay. So this slide is here simply to connect us back to Bernstein. I've already covered the first two bullet points. The third one introduces the term primitive accumulation, which is a technical term referring to the processes by which these classes of capitalists and workers came into being, and especially the commodification of land and labor, the turning of land and labor into things that can be freely bought and sold, disposed of in the marketplace. Now, there's a huge, complicated literature about primitive accumulation, and there's some debates about exactly how to understand it. It should be stressed that the term primitive here is actually a translation from the German, from Marx, and another way you could translate that term is original. So by primitive here, we don't mean to say that it's somehow brutish, although it frequently is. We don't mean to say that it's characteristic of primitive conditions. We mean to say this is the process by which land and labor become freely disposable property, and thereby create the conditions in which there's a group of people who have to sell their labor power because that's all they own. They don't have other ways of accessing land or accessing the means of production other than to sell their labor power. Now, when we watch Black Gold, when we watch some of the other movies this semester, later on this semester, you should look for this. You should look for the variety of ways in which these two classes of people have been or are being produced in different parts of the world at different points in time. Because there's an enormous variety of ways this can happen, and there are an enormous variety of other conditions that contribute to making it happen in different times and places. So it's not like it's crystal clear everywhere. Land is now commodified. Labor is now commodified. It's actually quite messy and blurry. And this process is one that we need to think about for this part of the semester, because this is a way of thinking about how capitalist production spread out around the world on the heels of colonialism. You know, how did we get from slavery production of sugar to plantations that didn't employ slaves but instead employed wage laborers? Because a slave is actually not a wage laborer, because a slave cannot voluntarily decide to work for some particular person, and a slave typically is not paid, right? So how that happens is sort of the focus for the next chunk of the semester. Now, some of this history, background, for the case of how this emerged in England. Here is a map of Europe circa 1648, after the Peace of Westphalia. And you'll notice that many parts of Europe, France, Spain, England, Ireland, Portugal, these are nation states at this point in time. This middle part of Europe is not a nation state at this time. It's the Holy Roman Empire, but it's divided up into all sorts of sort of subunits. It's a sort of mishmash consortium alliance of different kinds of political organizations, still internally organized in a feudal fashion. What did Westphalia, what's the Treaty of Westphalia famous for? Anybody know? Yes? It institutionalized state sovereignty in the modern sense of the word. So you look at England and France, for example, or France and Spain, what happened here is the powers of Europe agreed that there should be territorial boundaries and that each state would be sovereign within those boundaries. Those boundaries would be coterminous. And each state, moreover, would recognize the sovereignty of the other states within their territories. So this is a landmark moment in history. It brought everybody around the table to agree on a basic framework for political organization and international relations. Previously, there really wasn't anything international, right? You can't have anything between nations until you have a stable set of nations who can have relations between each other, right? Westphalia creates this framework. And our own sense to this day of what a nation-state is and notions of territory and territoriality and sovereignty are all built on this framework. So it's an important moment. And what happened, I mean, it's important here that England and France, for example, were already nation-states, whereas the rest of Europe, in many ways, were not, right? You still had the Spanish Habsburgs controlling these territories, the Austrian Habsburgs controlling these, this weird mishmash of the Holy Roman Empire. England, and we're going to focus on England, was organized internally as a nation-state in this sense. It had a unified fiscal and judicial system, and it had had one for hundreds of years at that point. The fact that it was an island made it fairly clear what its boundaries were. Its borders had a kind of natural reinforcement. It had a legal system that was national in scale. Its laws applied to the entire nation and were not internally variegated by subunits such as different feudal holdings, right? And this legal system was fiscally coordinated with taxation and spending. You had a centralized state that assessed taxes and spent revenues at that national scale. These different components fit together, the legal structure, the fiscal structure, and the physical geographical territory of the nation state. It had a less expensive government than most of the rest of Europe. It was more efficient in the Weberian sense. The nobles paid taxes, which was not true in a lot of other parts of Europe. And this empowered the state in ways that were not true elsewhere. It really helps to be able to tax the wealthiest people in your nation, right? They've got the most money. If you can tax them, you stand a much better chance of being able to raise enough revenue to sort of have a powerful state. The nobility was not nearly as autonomous, as free to ignore or dispute the central government as was the case elsewhere in Europe. Heritable peasant tenure was replaced by negotiable rents. This has to do with the commodification of land. Instead of a system in which, as was the case under feudalism, it wasn't only the nobles whose claim to land ownership was heritable in the sense that it could be passed down to subsequent generations. The peasants as well had a kind of heritable land tenure claim. If your parents worked as peasants on a given lord's land, you too had a claim to be able to work there. You were the lord's peasant, and the lord wasn't free to just pretend that you weren't. It was expected that the lord would actually recognize you as having a right to be there. In England, this got replaced. They said, no, we can actually have kind of deals. You can each strike a deal. The lord can go to you and say, all right, you can farm here, but you've got to give me a certain percentage of what you grow. And the peasant could say, well, no, I can't make that much this year. How about this much instead? And they could bargain back and forth, which is not to say that there were no disputes, but it was actually turned into a kind of case-by-case negotiable deal rather than just a across-the-board non-negotiable arrangement. And this allowed land use to begin to be just decoupled from tradition. It became much easier for individuals to decide to change how much land they were going to farm, what they were going to grow, to negotiate with the owner of the land about how much they were going to pay, to make decisions based not just on, well, we've always done it this way, but based on what would make the most sense for us. Maybe we should redistribute who farms how much land here and think again about what should be grown, because there's an opportunity to make a more profit by growing corn instead of wheat, for instance. And this led, as early as the 16th century, to agricultural improvement, which is in scare quotes here, partially just to alert you to the notion that this is about efficiency. This is about calculation of rational decision-making in land use and land tenure, breaking away from a tradition-bound system of decision-making. One of the major products that was being produced on this land was wool from sheep. And initially, most of that wool was sold to France, primarily, where it was turned into cloth. But about 1400, the English began to manufacture their own cloth from that wool to spin and weave it into fabrics. And as this industry grew, it made the production of sheep using extensive land use, which is to say using large amounts of land to raise sheep, growing pasture grasses and forage, profitable. It created a lot of jobs in the mills where this wool was being spun and woven, and it eroded the urban guild labor controls that had previously applied. It had previously been the case that there was a guild of laborers who did these things, who made textiles, and they controlled access to that market very strictly. That began to break down as more and more people entered this line of production. And the unified state, with its clearly demarcated boundaries and powers of taxation, was able to protect this nascent domestic industry by setting up barriers to foreign competition. So the British became a source of woolen textiles rather than simply a source of raw materials for other people's mills. There was a political revolution that took 48 years, the Glorious Revolution in the middle of the 17th century, latter part of the 17th century, which further encouraged improvement and industry. The biggest thing it did was abolish royal absolutism. What's that? The power of the king to simply say, this is how it shall be. The power of the king to declare whatever he or she, I should say king or queen, wants as law. Whether it's consistent with other cases, inconsistent with what happened last week or not. Royal absolutism, basically this was the initiation of the idea of some kind of check on royal power through the parliament. The feudal lords were stripped of their ability to exact tribute, which is to say payment simply for being the lord, the feudal lord, although of course they could still exact rent. It favored profit-making interests among a wide variety of classes, landowners, merchants, and manufacturers. So you got a kind of across the board of the elite in that society, all focused on rational, profit-seeking, productive activity. And over the course of hundreds of years, there was a series of laws passed by Parliament that consolidated the control of landowners over their land as private property, known as the Enclosure Acts. This basically said the aristocracy, the land that they own, they are free to do as they see fit with, including disposing of it, selling it, and including throwing peasants off of it if they see that as in their advantage, if they wish to. And what you got was a lot of aristocrats deciding, I'm not going to have peasants growing food on this land anymore because it would be more profitable for me to get rid of the peasants and raise sheep and sell the wool from those sheep into these booming mills. And this cut labor free from the land. Those laborers, by and large, migrated to cities and began working in those factories. So these are you see that this is not a simple matter. There are a lot of contributing factors. There are legal and political ones, there are economic ones, there are technological ones that make this, that pull together this collection of circumstances in which this system can emerge. So, Weber. With the 19th century, production was freed from the organic limitations in which nature had held it confined. At the same time, however, crises became an imminent factor of the economic order. The social order itself may be held responsible for the crisis, even to the poorest laborer. And I want to emphasize two things here about this passage. I think this is an important analysis of what happens in the 19th century. The first is in the first part, freed from the organic limitations in which nature had held it confined. What does he mean by that? Any idea? There's a very specific thing. It is about technological inventions, but he's talking about a very specific thing here. He's talking about energy. He's talking about coal. He's identifying the point in time at which coal enables work to be done on a scale that had not previously been possible. And this is precisely because it is concentrated energy. And the that it was constant, that you could burn coal had been known for hundreds and thousands of years. But it could be, as of the 19th century, used in industrial processes that were technologically enabled and enabled vast amounts of work to be done that previously had to be done either by the force of water falling over a mill wheel, or by animals, or by people. That was their source of energy for work previously. And then the second is this part about crisis. He says, crisis becomes imminent to the economic order. So the social order becomes responsible for the crisis. And previously, if there was a crisis of production, it was typically due to drought or some climatic variation, some pest, locusts, who knows? There was certainly the possibility of crises in production, but they were essentially outside of the social order. There was nobody you could specifically blame. Sure, and under previous systems, you might have been able to point to the rain-making spirit mediator and say, wait a minute, you were supposed to bring the rain. But that is not an option here anymore. We all know better than that. That's irrational. Now, if there were to be crises in the system, they were not going to be about drought. They were actually going to be about the economic system itself. They were internal to the economic system. And we will come back to that, provided I have enough time, by the end of the lecture. These two things are extremely interesting and important components of capitalism, and it's interesting that they are present here in Weber, rather than only in the writings of, say, Marx, who's known as a critic of capitalism. Weber is known basically as an analyst of capitalism, and he sees these things as intrinsic to capitalism itself. So here, we have some images of early coal mines being tended. I think that's intended to be actually an elderly woman simply lighting up the shafts, right? Towns that became choked with the soot and pollution of these early mines and mills. The construction of factories and apparatuses on a massive mechanical scale. British coal production skyrocketed in the centuries leading up to the Industrial Revolution. Tenfold increase from 1550 to 1700, up to 3 million tons per year, or half a ton per person. Probably 5 times greater than the rest of the world combined as of 1700. 4/5 of world production was coming out of England in 1830. And it expanded another tenfold from 1700 to 1830, and then doubled again in the next 24 years. England had a lot of coal. And they figured out ways to mine it and use it much more efficiently than before. And that is because they discovered ways to use it as a source not just of heat, not just of warmth, to warm your house or cook your food, but as a source of motive power, to convert heat into motion, work. So how does this work? You burn the coal, it releases the heat. You heat water, boil it, and it becomes steam. The steam expands. When steam cools, it contracts, the opposite, right? And that creates a vacuum if you've got it in a closed container. The air pressure created by this expansion and contraction can be made to move a piston. And then that piston, in turn, can move a wheel, for example. This is internal combustion, basically. There was a machine, the previous machine for doing this, Thomas Newcomen's atmospheric engine, was first installed in a mine in 1712 and was widespread by 1760. And this is, why was it installed in a mine? Why would you first think of putting a steam engine in a mine? Any idea? No? Well, first of all, there's a bunch of coal there, right? So it's not hard to get the coal you need to power the engine. Coal is heavy. It's expensive to move. It's convenient not to have to move it very far. Second of all, the biggest issue as production expanded, exponentially, the biggest problem they faced was water filling the mines. You dig a hole in the ground, you pull out the coal, eventually you're going to hit the water table, and the mine is going to fill up with water. And this was seen as a threat, literally, to the nation as a whole, because you had to get that water out in some way in order to keep digging. And this was an engine that could pump water out of mines rapidly enough to keep ahead of it coming back in and enable you to keep digging further for more coal. And that's basically what this engine was used for, because it was actually too expensive to use it for much of anything else, because this engine wasn't very efficient. It used enormous amounts of coal, and yeah, you're doing this to enable more coal production, but if you use so much coal pumping the water out that you don't get any extra coal for the effort, it's not worth it, right? James Watt's steam engine was not a new idea. It was just an improvement on Newcomen's idea, but it was an enormous improvement. It enabled the loss of the heat in cooling the steam to happen separately from the heating of the water where you were producing steam. It separated those two things out, so you didn't lose all that heat and have to put it back in to get the next batch of steam, basically. He was working with backing from an industrialist. There had to be an R&D budget, even back then, to support the figuring out of this technology. He was working with a craftsman, John Wilkinson, who was particularly skilled, sort of the best in the world at his craft, which enabled them to produce the actual machinery to a level of quality that would make this work. But it increased energy output per unit of coal by 400%. And this meant that it was now economical not only to keep pumping water out deeper and deeper and deeper and get more and more coal out of the ground, but it also meant that you could put these machines in factories, and the work they could do in those factories more than covered the costs of getting the coal there to power the machines, which was key. That was the real key. Previously, coal was so heavy and so expensive to move, and the engines, the Newcomen engine was so inefficient that it didn't make economic sense to use coal to power factories. With Watt's machine, it did. It made coal cheaper, and it made the use of coal to power factories profitable. And the Industrial Revolution really takes off from those circumstances, aimed not just at wool production, but then at cotton production, spinning, weaving, producing, and then manufacturing clothing from the cloth that resulted. Coal also enabled power and transportation systems on a scale previously unknown. The production of iron was made vastly more efficient and cheaper by the production of coal, or rather by the steam engine and its ability to use coal to produce energy and motive power. And you get a period of enormous canal building that is also made possible by the steam engine. Now, I don't have time to tell every last story related to these slides, but just to run you through some of the innovations that followed that sort of continually found the weakest or most inefficient point in a production system. Effort was focused on improving the technology to unlock that bottleneck, and they all sort of fed on each other. The spinning jenny, the steam-powered mule, the power loom, and finally the cotton factory. One cotton factory like this could be powered by a single enormous steam engine that simply ran a series of belts and cables so that each one of these looms could be powered by these belts coming down that were being turned by a shaft. These shafts were all connected to a single steam engine. And this enabled economies of scale and scales of production that were vastly larger than anything seen before. The cotton gin, a way of making more efficient the removal of seeds from raw cotton so that you could produce more cotton. There was a bottleneck at one point simply that the machinery was there, but you couldn't get enough cotton fast enough to feed all of the mills. You get even bigger factories. Child labor becomes a major issue as a lot of these jobs are held by children. Manchester is the center of this early industrial revolution. You get a powerful connection to the United States. Cotton production in the U.S. South skyrockets from $5.2 million in 1800 to $75 million just 40 years later, and almost double that again a mere 10 years after that. The number of slaves grows in connection with this. The overall U.S. cotton production goes from 3,000 bales in 1790 to 4.5 million bales in 1860 to feed these mills. You get a lot of land consolidation in the southern United States. The yellow areas here are areas where of all farms, more than 10% were larger than 50 acres in size. And the red areas, they're between 5 and 9%. That's a significant thing, right? If even only 10% of farms are that large, each one of those landowners is controlling a significant amount of land. There might be a lot of smaller farms, but the overall landscape is essentially dominated by these large sort of industrial scale plantations. This also helped drive the displacement of a lot of native peoples, the most famous being the Cherokee. This is the Trail of Tears, the forced movement of the Cherokee from their native lands in the southeast, eventually all the way to Oklahoma. Their original land claims covered a great deal of the southeast. They began to shrink even by 1790. By 1838, they were this small, and they eventually ended up being forced to march all the way to Oklahoma, essentially to make way for the production of cotton in the southeast. This is also going on elsewhere in the world. This is India, of all places, where there's also significant cotton production being undertaken at this time, again, to feed the mills in the United Kingdom. Canals. Oh, man, how am I going to do the bibliography thing? How many people really need me to demonstrate using search engines on the library website? 1, 2. Okay. Should we do that for the last 10 minutes instead of this? Or should we wrap this up? All right. If it's only that many people, I would encourage you to ask your GSI to help. I was going to basically ask one of you to provide your idea for a paper topic, and then I was going to run a few searches and show you how easy it is to do. But I think I'd like to finish this. Is that agreeable? Okay. The Erie Canal was built between 1817 and 1825. It was made possible by steam engines to excavate the earth. It went along with railroads that were built in conjunction with the construction of the canal, and it enabled the movement of goods between the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Seaway and New York. Now, when this was first undertaken, it was basically paid for with European capital. And it was considered at the time something of a risk. But it turned out to be extremely profitable because it enabled trade from the interior United States on water rather than over land over the Appalachian Mountains, right? It opened up the interior of the United States to eastern markets through New York City. It helped make New York City into an enormous shipping terminal. And they not only made money, and not only other people who made money, but the investors in the canal made money as well from the various kinds of tolls they could charge for boats, for barges to float through on the canal. And this became an important moment because when the capitalist investors realized how much money could be made in canal building, they went elsewhere and did more of it. And it also helped trigger the boom in railroad production, because it was, as soon as you got a canal and a railroad running next to it, it wasn't long before it was discovered that if the railroad could be improved and if locomotives and trains could be improved, they could be even faster than water as a way of moving goods. You see an enormous ballooning of the earnings of U.S. railroad companies after the Civil War and the building of mileage of railroad track from 93,000 miles to 150,000 miles in a 40-year period of time. You see an enormous growth in the ton miles of railroad freight. The building of the Suez Canal between 1854 and 1869 was an even larger example of the same idea. It cut travel time between England and Eastern Asia in half. It bankrupted the Egyptian government, which initially tried to undertake this. They basically borrowed money from the British and the French to pay to build the Suez Canal. And then they failed to repay those loans. And the British and the French got together and said, okay, they owe us all this money, what should we do? And they said, well, let's just go take over the country. And they did. The British went to Egypt in 1882 and said, you've defaulted, we now own your country. And they were there for 72 years. The Panama Canal, the grandest of them all, 1879 to 1888, and then again, here again, the French actually tried to do it and they failed, and the U.S. stepped in and finished the job between 1903 and 1914. As we've already discussed this in connection with the Northwest Passage and cutting travel times through the Arctic. Well, the Panama Canal cut travel times enormously between Europe and Asia and the west coast of North America. The biggest, well, one of the biggest reasons the French couldn't get the job done, anybody know? Malaria. The workers were falling dead from malaria so quickly that they couldn't keep going. And discoveries of ways to combat malaria, quinine and that sort of thing actually helped make it possible. But they also needed just more capital. You can see the scale of this undertaking and the use, again, of steam-powered engines to do the digging, trains to move the material back and forth, and build the locks necessary to operate the Panama Canal. All of these things essentially becoming mutually reinforcing, contributing factors in the evolution of capitalism. The profits from each of these enterprises could then be poured back into complementary activities and scaling up over and over and over again in one field after another. So you get the commercialization emerging out of mercantilism. We'll have to talk about that some another time. Paper representations, again, all of these things mediated by these pieces of paper representing ownership in enterprise and rights to income, state bonds, for example, as I suggested already. These paper representations were actually initially issued by states or municipalities rather than private companies to finance wars, rationalize revenue flows, underwrite various commercial endeavors. They only later evolved into what we think of as stocks, shares in private enterprise, what we're most familiar with today. Weber talks about this, how it sort of morphed from a state power into a private practice. Speculation is the key part is what becomes possible once those paper shares are tradable in their own right. And this is where Weber is going to say speculative crises are endemic to capitalism. You cannot have capitalism without having the risk of speculation, and you cannot have speculation without periodic bubbles popping. Okay? Irrational speculation, we'll talk later about the different ways in which these bubbles can burst. But the point I'm trying to drive home right now is basically you can't have capitalism without speculative bubbles. They go together. They are necessarily related to each other. And then this is the last slide pointing out the ways in which, in the case of sugar prices, you get speculations as a sort of characteristic feature. These wild price swings are a necessary feature. All right, sorry to rush. And we will watch a movie on Thursday, and then it will be spring break. Yay!